At Hillcrest High School, there was one teacher who everyone had heard of, Mrs. Thompson. She had taught history for over 20 years, and though she had a reputation for being tough, it was her sharp tongue and biased attitude that made students wary of her. Mrs. Thompson had never been one to shy away from making her opinions known, especially when it came to students of color. Her words could sting, and her judgments often cut deep. One morning, a new student arrived in her class, a confident, intelligent young girl named Zara. Zara was black, with a radiant smile and a quiet determination that her peers quickly admired. She had moved to the town with her father, who was the new principal of Hillcrest High. The students didn't know this yet. Zara had chosen to keep it to herself, not wanting any special treatment. From the very first day, Mrs. Thompson's biases were evident. Zara, eager to prove herself, raised her hand to answer questions and participate in discussions. But Mrs. Thompson ignored her, instead calling on the other students, often giving them compliments, no matter how irrelevant their answers were. Zara remained polite, but each time she was overlooked, it felt as though she were invisible in Mrs. Thompson's eyes. One day, Mrs. Thompson made a particularly hurtful remark when Zara answered a question in class. "Well, Zara," Mrs. Thompson sneered, "it's nice to see someone from your background try to keep up." The comment was a subtle jab at Zara's race, cloaked in the guise of sarcasm, but it stung just the same. The class went silent. A few students exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said a word. Zara sat in her seat, her hands trembling slightly, but she refused to let Mrs. Thompson see her hurt. Instead, she focused on keeping her composure, something she had learned to do in a world that often underestimated her. The next day, during lunch, Zara's father, Principal Morgan, walked into the cafeteria to speak with the staff. Mrs. Thompson, unaware of Zara's connection to the principal, approached him casually, greeting him with her usual confident smile. "Mr. Morgan, it's so nice to see you here. I've been meaning to speak with you about your daughter. She seems a little too confident for someone her age, don't you think? She's been trying to take over the class discussions, acting as if she's the expert on everything," Mrs. Thompson said with a forced smile, not realizing who she was speaking to. Principal Morgan's expression darkened as he listened, the words hitting him like a cold slap. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid you're mistaken. Zara is an extremely bright student, and she deserves respect, just like every other student in this school." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "And I suggest you treat her with the same dignity you would any other student. I am very proud of her, and I expect that to be reflected in your behavior." Mrs. Thompson, taken aback by the sternness in his voice, stammered for a moment, trying to recover her composure. I didn't know. I mean, I had no idea," she said, suddenly realizing her mistake. The next day, Zara was sitting in Mrs. Thompson's class, her head held high, when Mrs. Thompson unexpectedly approached her after class. "Zara, I owe you an apology," she said, her voice softer than usual. "I have been unfair to you, and I want to make it right." Zara met her gaze with a mixture of surprise and guarded optimism. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," she said calmly, though inside she was grateful that her father's influence had brought justice. From that day on, Mrs. Thompson's attitude toward Zara shifted. She began to call on her more often, recognizing her brilliance and contributions to the class. But Zara knew that the respect she had earned had nothing to do with her father's position. It had everything to do with the fact that she had stood her ground, despite being unfairly targeted. As the school year went on, Zara's strength became an example for others. She showed that no matter how challenging the situation, it was important to stand up for oneself and remain true to who you are. The power of self-respect and dignity can change the way others see you, even if they don't want to. Mrs. Thompson eventually learned that the strength of a person wasn't determined by their background or appearance. It was shaped by their resilience, their intelligence, and their character. And Zara, the daughter of the principal, had proven that even in the face of prejudice, she was more than capable of shining.